3, 2, 1, and we are live. I don't see myself yet. There I am. How you doing, friends? Ernie here, and this is the 0 Days to Expiration podcast, episode number 78. That means that there are 76 other episodes chock full of options expiration genius. Well, actually, there's only 75 because there still is that missing episode number 70, which does not exist. Someday it will appear. Today, we're going to talk. Today's going to be a short podcast, and it's really going to state a modification to our strategy. Not a modification, really, more like an adjunct to take care, not take advantage, but take care or adjust to the current market conditions. These market conditions that I'm speaking of is ultra low liquidity. So over the past 2 months or so, leading up to the Fed finally coming up with some sort of clarity around whether or not they're going to hike interest rates. Yeah, we got to turn that off. Hike interest rates. The liquidity in the market has been slowly diminishing, and I'll explain this in a second. Liquidity, first of all, can be measured in options terms by open interest. What is open interest? Open interest are the number of contracts that are in play in the market. Now, as you know, we trade the E-mini futures with the 0 DTE event. And we trade the futures, the E-mini S&P, that's the ES/ES. We trade that because it has a lot of advantages over the SPX or the SPY. And the principal advantage it has is that it trades 24 hours a day. Well, it's actually 23 hours a day, 5.5 days a week. But that's a huge advantage. Plus, compared to the SPX, it also has volume. The SPX has no volume because it's not real. It's just a calculated index. You can't actually trade the SPX. You can trade derivatives of the index. The other advantage that the E-mini futures has is that it is not subject to the pattern day trader rule like the SPX is. So that means that people with small accounts can take advantage of this wonderful 0-DTE strategy. Otherwise, they would need an account that has at least $25,000 in it, and if it was under that, they'd have to be taking extra care to make sure that they do not violate that rule. Otherwise, they could get slapped with a restriction that will keep them from trading for up to 90 days. So all of these are advantages of the E-mini futures. One of the disadvantages is that compared to the SPX or even compared to the SPY, the E-mini futures has a lower volume and a lower open interest as a result. As I said, open interest are the number of contracts that are actually in play. That's the number of puts and calls that people put on, whether long calls, long puts, whatever it is. It's the number of contracts that are in play. Now, the interesting thing is that this is a proxy for liquidity. Will show up as a histogram at the different strike prices. You'll notice that open interest seems to congregate over certain price levels. And this is very akin to the volume profile, where the volume profile has a lot of volume associated with different price levels, and they appear as nodes on the profile, or wells where there is a lack of volume. And we use this in the volume profile world because we know that when there's a large node surrounding a price level, we know that price tends to gravitate towards that node. Well, it's the same thing with options. When you have open interest that is built up around a particular strike price, that price tends to gravitate towards that level. Now, One thing that we've been experiencing lately are liquidity traps, where you think that you have the liquidity necessary to enter a trade and that there are counterparties there that you have really no worry about getting in and out of the trade with a halfway decent spread. And you can get a good price going in, you can get a good price coming out. No problem coming out because there's plenty of people out there. However, what's been happening in this really sketchy market, this market where the Fed has really created this environment where traders are, they're nervous. They're nervous. They'll get in, they'll get out quickly. Liquidity will dry up, leaving anybody that's in a trade in a very difficult spot, making it difficult for them to exit that trade. And where in some cases that in other times you would look at that trade and you'd say, man, this is awesome. I'm right there inside my profit tent. I can get out, no problem. And then you notice that your P&L is concaved. And you're like, what? This doesn't make any sense. It should have a nice big blooming P&L curve for me. But it doesn't. That's what's called a liquidity trap. You're in there and then you're stuck waiting for time to start getting on your side and then filling up that premium. But it never really happens. It doesn't happen until at the very end of the day. And by that time, price may have moved outside of your profitable range and you're trapped. You can't get in, you can't get out. Your only option is to get out with what could be a substantial loss, even a greater loss than the max loss or the defined risk that you chose to take. So you may choose then to just wait until expiration so that you can get that max loss or that defined risk that you chose in the beginning. And fortunately, with our strategy, we always choose asymmetric trades, so the defined risk is relatively small compared to the profit that we're going after. However, if you're in a position where normally you would be in profit, yet you can't get out because of this liquidity trap, this vacuum of liquidity, and if you had executed the trade right then and there, you could realistically and theoretically exit at a price or a loss greater than that defined risk that you took. That's crazy. That has been the problem of liquidity. So there are ways that you can work around this. One way that you can work around this is to place your strategies around strike prices that have a great deal of, or a relatively large amount of open interest. And so that brings me to this whole concept of max pain. Now, what is max pain? Max pain, let's explain this a little bit more. In the market, you have people that are going long options, going long calls, going long puts, and they'll aggregate or accumulate at various strike prices and so forth. And if you took the aggregate of all of those, they want to be able to get to their price so that they can get out of the market in the money and make some money. Option sellers, on the other hand, are taking the opposite side of that. They want those prices to be out of the money. There is an aggregate, if you took all the open interest, there is an aggregate between calls and puts where people who are long both calls and puts, there is one price or one strike that would produce the maximum amount of loss for whether or not you are going long a call or a long a put. So there is this one price, and that's called the max pain price. You may notice that if you ever watched Max Pain, that the market often will gravitate towards that price because that's the aggregate price that all people that are long in the market are going to feel the pain. And it's also the aggregate point where option sellers are trying to push the market to through whatever means that they might be doing that, maybe institutional players or whatever, where they get the maximum profit. Now, it doesn't always happen that way. Price doesn't always gravitate towards the max pain point, this aggregate. However, price does often migrate towards one of these liquidity bumps or accumulation of liquidity at certain strike levels. Maybe not the aggregate one, but a specific price. In the same way that works with volume profile, where price tends to migrate towards a volume node. So really, actually on Friday of last week, we had the max pain at 4,400 in the market. And right at the very end of the market, right near the end of expiration, price was hovering right around 4,400. And it stayed there almost right up to the very last minute, and then finally fell off by about 5 or 10 points. But that was an example of pinning a trade on max pain. And you may have heard me talk about pinning trades with our butterflies and pinning it right on those short strikes in the butterfly, and we love to do that. But now imagine if you take both of those concepts and you combine them and you say, okay, I'm going to try to take the butterfly short strikes where I want to be pinned, and I'm going to align that where max pain exists, or that level where you get the aggregate maximum pain for people who are long in the market. That is going to benefit people who are short in the market, because that's what we are. We are sellers of premium. We want to be where the people who are short in the market are going to benefit most. So that is the type of strategy that we might use in our 0DTE toolkit to optimize the possibility of profiting or maximizing the kind of profit that we can take. Now, max pain works out the aggregate pain of these liquidity areas works out a fairly regular amount of time, but it doesn't work all the time. The aggregate doesn't work all the time. It's inconsistent. So it's very difficult to develop a strategy saying that's what we're going to do. We're always going to place our butterfly short strikes right over the max pain for the entire market for that day. However, it does tend to gravitate towards one of the liquidity levels. In other words, there are, like I said, there may be several levels within the range of strike prices in an options contract on that day of expiration that have abnormally high levels of open interest. And so those are areas that we would concentrate on, or maybe we would look for clusters and position our butterflies or our option collection strategies around those clusters. And we know that we don't have to pin it all the time to make good profit. As a matter of fact, we can be on the edge of those liquidity areas and still profit very well. That's how we're combating liquidity. There is one other more basic way that we can combat the lack of liquidity or a liquidity trap, and that is if we recognize that the liquidity is so sparse, or really there's no real clear place where you can place a strategy to optimize your chance of making profit, and maybe not even able to get the kind of risk to reward that we want, then we'll simply step aside and say, we're not going to play this game today. So those are our two strategies. Don't play the game, or play the game where the game is being played. I guess that's the way you can say it, where max pain is. We derive pleasure from max pain. There you go. All right, that's all I have to say for today's 0-DTE strategy moment. If you'd like to take advantage of our strategy, if you would like to learn about our strategy, methods, and process, you can try out the service by going to 0-dte.com/try. Get a 4-week trial. And after that 4 weeks, if you become a member, we'll rebate the cost of that trial. And you'll be in our family of now 500 plus traders and growing very quickly. Thank you very much. I hope everybody has a great day, and peace to you all. Max Payne.